if you have questions and or comments, just put them all in the question box down there on your interface, and we'll get to those either during or just after. We do a Q&A session afterwards. I'm joined today by Brad Rippey from USDA, Chief Economist Office back in DC. He's our, besides Jeff and BJ, he'll be our sort of ag specialist, ag climate specialist. And why don't we just get down to business? I don't think there's anything else I need to tell you other than listen closely. So thank you. And BJ, why don't you take it away? Then we'll switch over to Jeff for the second half. So thank you very much, BJ.
All right. Thanks, Doug. Like Doug said, my name is BJ Bowley. My colleague Jeff Andrees and I are going to be giving the North Central Region Climate and Drought Outlook for today, and it's January 20th of 2022. There you'll see some of the logos of the organizations that are involved in this effort. And on your right there, you'll see a nice picture of sunset in Minnesota from a few days ago, provided by Nancy Boulay. Oh, why is my thing not going? Oh, there it goes. Okay. So before we get started into the recent conditions, the impacts, and the outlooks, and the normal stuff that we do, just want to note a few things before we get started. These webinars are provided to the Central Region as a climate service, and it's a collaboration between the state climatologists and the American Association of State Climatologists, NOAA, USDA Climate Hubs, the Midwest and High Plains Regional Climate Center, as well as the Drought Mitigation Center. Next month, our speaker will be Peter Goebel from the Colorado State Climate Office, and that'll be on the 17th, same time. And below there are links where you can find information about upcoming and future webinars, and then recordings of past webinars. And like Doug mentioned at the beginning, we'll be open for questions at the end. So just a brief overview of what we're going to cover today. We're going to go through a little bit about recent conditions and what we've been seeing across the region over the last month since we had this webinar the last time. And then Jeff's going to cover some of the direct impacts we've seen from those recent conditions, and then talk about what we're expecting, you know, as we look forward over the next couple months into the next few seasons. So first, we're going to take a look back, and we're going to talk about the snow or the lack thereof it across a lot of the region a little bit later. But just want to note on there, while we've been relatively warm and dry, or at least dry, in the Midwest and the Central Region, when I was home for Christmas this year, we had our first white Christmas since 1983 in the Willamette Valley in Oregon. So strange weather everywhere. So looking back at the month of December, putting it into historical context in terms of temperature, we note that across the region, it was very warm. There were several states that had their warmest year on record. In our region, that's specifically Nebraska, Kansas, and Missouri, which borders that big region across the South that also experienced record warm Decembers, and that goes back to 1895. We also had quite a few others in the top 10 across the eastern part of the region. Kentucky, Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois were also their second warmest, as well as Colorado out there on the western edge of the region. Iowa was third warmest, and Michigan and Wyoming were both tied for their ninth warmest year Decembers on record. So pretty warm across the region. North Dakota was near average with 69 out of 127, with 127 being the warmest. And then the one cool spot in our region to note is there in Montana. They had their 41st warmest December on record. So a little bit cooler, not a top 10 coldest. So the warm temperatures definitely dominating over December. So along with those unseasonable temperatures also came some unseasonable weather. We note that some of these were noted during the last month's webinar, but now that we got some of more final numbers in, wanted to note these here. So on December 10th and 11th and the 15th, there were tornado outbreaks across the region, across Kentucky, Ohio, Missouri, and then the 15th was more across Nebraska, Iowa, Minnesota, up into Wisconsin. There were 193 confirmed tornadoes during the month of December, the bulk of them happening during these outbreaks. The previous record nationally was 99, and that was set in 2002. Records of these tornadoes go back to 1950. And just to put this in perspective, the average number that we see in December is 36 over the last 20 years. And usually December is our second lowest month for tornadic activity, the lowest being January. Also, another fact that from this outbreak, it also included tornadoes in Minnesota. That's the first on record in December, I believe. And then it also spawned some unusual weather patterns across Iowa, up in Wisconsin, in the form of a derecho, so a fast-moving line of intense thunderstorms. That's typically a summer feature. So that was another thing that we called out. In terms of precipitation, since we usually cover things in terms of temperature and precipitation here, it was a bit more mixed, not as drastic across most of the region, but we'll really note the difference. There was some dryness across the southern plains. So Kansas there had its 10th driest December on record. And then the rest of the region, Nebraska was a little bit dry. Iowa, Illinois, Missouri, Kentucky were near average. And other states tended wet. For the top 10, there were only 2 states that had top 10 wettest months, and that was Minnesota with their 2nd wettest December on record, and North Dakota with their 9th wettest December on record. And since December rounds out the calendar year, we wanted to look back on 2021 and just put that in perspective as well. So notice on that map there on your left, quite a few above average temperatures. The southern part of the region, with ours, which would be Kansas, Missouri, and Kentucky, were above average. The rest of the region was much above average for the year. And if we put it in context for the entire region there on the right, that's a time series dating back to 1895. There's 125 years in that record. And the region as a whole was the 114th warmest, so 11th warmest on record as a whole for 2021. In terms of rainfall, it was really a tale of 2 regions. We'll see there in 2021, the eastern states in our region, there were all above average for rainfall. Then central plains, mostly near average. And then as we taper off to the north and the west, we saw quite a bit lower precipitation totals for the year. So there's ongoing concerns around dryness in that region. Probably the one of note there would be Montana, and that had their 9th driest year on record for 2021. And as a region, because of that gradient across the region, with it being wet in the east and dry in the west, it kind of comes out to a middling year for the regional average. So we're looking at about the 46th wettest year in terms of 2021, where that fits. So big contrast from, say, 2019, a few years ago, where we had our wettest year on record for the region. So moving to the last 30 days. So we talked about December in 2021. So let's talk about the last 2 weeks and how that fits into the last 30 days. So during the last part of December, temperatures were below normal across much of the region. We really saw a shift around New Year's for most of the region. That's really what you're seeing here. We saw below average temperatures across the northern tier that was associated with some Arctic systems and snowstorms that moved across the region. Temperatures were above average across the south. And then in the middle, it kind of was a gradient, above average in the south, near average in the middle, and then below average in the north. And again, this is more due to a fact of being warm in the last half of December and colder since New Year's. How this looks at one site specifically, just wanted to point out, this is Chicago O'Hare's International Airport in a time series from the beginning of December through the 17th of January. And some notes on the right there, the blue bars are daily high and low temperatures, the reds, the record high, the blue on the bottom, the record low. And what you really want to note there is around January 1st, so about the 2/3 mark on that time series, those daily temperatures really come down. And that's what we're talking about, where we have that warm air mass, that warm pattern, and then it's going to shift over the whole, most of the region to that colder pattern we've seen since New Year's. In terms of rainfall the last 30 days, really most of the region, we've been below average for much of the region. This is our low precipitation time of the year. So some of these departures look pretty radical, but in terms of percentage, they may not amount to a lot in terms of liquid. But what we see here is that ongoing dryness in the central plains. That's an ongoing concern, and then also up into Montana as well. We did see some above average areas over the last 30 days. North Dakota and northern Minnesota with those winter systems I mentioned. Northwest Colorado saw a lot of snow accumulation in the higher elevations. And then down there on the bottom right of the map, you'll also notice the Ohio River Valley with some of those severe weather systems we mentioned, an ongoing active weather pattern up the valley there. Saw quite a bit of precipitation over the last month. How is this translated in terms of soil moisture? So it's midwinter, not a lot of active agriculture going on in our region, but looking towards spring, how is soil moisture looking? These are modeled data, but just to give you an idea, on the left there, you'll see today's soil moisture ranking percentile. And again, we're really in a tale of two regions with the I-states across the East Kentucky up into Ohio, you know, ranking in the top quarter of soil moisture percentiles. Also northeastern South Dakota, a little pocket of high soil moisture conditions there. But other than those, it's fairly dry across the region. Again, noting in Montana, we're down in the first percentile for soil moisture rankings as of today on this product. So that suggests that conditions are exceptionally dry. And since October 31st of 21, just to give an idea of how things changed across the fall, really except for some areas in northern Minnesota along Lake Superior in Wisconsin, that area, things have either stayed the same or slightly degraded in terms of soil moisture. So we've seen those soil moisture levels come down over the fall and into the winter. In terms of stream flow, again, it's a low flow season. You'll note that there are few observations across the high plains, Montana and Minnesota, and that's because things are frozen up this time of year. If they were flowing, given the soil moisture conditions, they may be lower. However, where we do have stream flow data across the eastern part of our region, things are near average across the central part of the central region. Then in the east, we do see some higher flows there in Kentucky and across Ohio. In terms of drought, this is the U.S. Drought Monitor for the Central Region that was just updated today. And there again, you'll see what we saw on the precipitation maps. The east, largely an absence of drought, no drought conditions reported, say in Indiana, Kentucky, Ohio. Most of Michigan, there are some D0 areas there on the periphery of the lower and across the UP. But as we move west, we see that dryness becoming a concern and ongoing and extreme and then even exceptional drought up in areas of Montana. So we really want to make note of that gradient across the region. It's been wet in the east and dry in the west, and that's ongoing and reflected here in the drought monitor. As far as changes over the last month in terms of drought class, most of the region has stayed the same. Seems some marginal improvement there in western Montana, western part of the Rockies, some across North Dakota, Minnesota, but most of it's staying unchanged. And the thing to note about those green areas on the western side of the region, most of that drains west. That doesn't really help the Missouri Basin out in terms of moisture supply. So that's where things are in terms of the drought monitor, how they've changed over the last month. And then it is winter, so we do have to talk about snow or the lack thereof it in some cases. So here's a map of the current snow depth across the region. You'll see out there in the west, the higher elevations, there is a substantial amount of snowpack building in those areas. However, in eastern Montana, eastern Wyoming, eastern Colorado, and then eastward across the region, you'll notice a large absence of snow. Really, the only appreciable snowpack across the Midwest right now is across North Dakota, Minnesota, and Wisconsin, and the UP of Michigan. So that's where things are right now. And in terms of water storage, there's not a lot out there in terms of what's on the landscape that's going to be coming the Missouri's way. So snow water equivalents right now across our region are largely low, but it is early in winter. There's a lot of time left, so we'll see where it goes. But just to look at the season a little more in context so far, what this map shows in the western part of our region, and what you really want to pay attention to is the right side of this map, where you do see this yellow and red. What this is basin percentile snow water equivalents. So just showing how much water is in the snow that's in these basins and how it compares to that historical average. There has been some noted conditions improving, especially in higher elevations, those in Colorado, but those largely aren't going to supply the Missouri. You notice those eastern drainage basins are still somewhat below or much below normal in some cases. So areas east of the Continental Divide are still a bit low on snow. In terms of the Midwest, we're quite low. So there are some areas that are above average as far as the season. North Dakota, Northwest Minnesota, and Kentucky, for what it's worth, have seen above average snowfall. The rest of the regions generally near or below average. And in the case of Illinois and Indiana, there's a real snow drought. So you'll notice that red bullseye on that right map there. That means there's been next to no snowfall in that area this year so far. So that's an ongoing concern, and we'll see if they get some snow down in the Illinois, Indiana area. Since we're from Michigan and it is winter, we do want to talk a bit about the Great Lakes in terms of temperatures and ice cover. Temperatures where we're seeing on here, where there is open water, things are cooling down. A lot of the temperatures below 40 degrees Fahrenheit. In terms of how this compares to normal, we have seen the lakes cooling off since the first of the year. before the first of the year, things were well above average and almost near the top of the historical distribution. And since then, things have cooled off a bit. We're still running about the 75th percentile total for Great Lakes temperature. So they are still warm, but it's coming back down to temperatures we have seen before. In terms of Great Lakes ice cover, as of today, about 11% of the lakes are ice covered, mostly along the peripheries and in the bays. That might not sound like a lot, but right now on the right there, that's the weekly observed ice cover on the blue, and then the green line is the normal from the Canadian Ice Service. And if you notice for this week, we're about right on average for this time of year. So this is a time of year where the lakes change pretty rapidly. So stay tuned there. And then just to kind of round it all out, since we've talked about winter, we talked about temperature, precipitation, snow, ice, you name it. This is a neat product that the Midwest Regional Climate Center hosts called the Accumulated Winter Season Severity Index. And what this is, it's a composite index, so it takes a bunch of different things into factor, like how cold has it been, how much snow has there been, and then rates them in context of historical averages, and you get categories, whether it's been an extremely bad winter or mild or somewhere in the middle. And across our region, really note, except for stations across Montana, North Dakota, and Minnesota, and some in the UP where they've had pretty much an average winter, across the rest of the region, it's been either moderate to mild. And in some cases, if you notice in Colorado and Wyoming, it's been a record mild winter so far. Also, some stations in Illinois there are showing record mild winters to date. That's there would be assumably due to the warm temperatures and lack of snow. So with that, that's kind of a view of where we've been, and going forward, Jeff's going to talk about the impacts and the outlooks.
Thank you.
Okay,
BJ.
there we go. Did it switch? I changed presenter. Yeah, I changed it to you, Jeff.
And I think I've got it's showing me, at least it thinks it has my presentation. I think I'm okay.
Well, I don't see your slides. I see impacts is what I see up there.
That's mine. So
okay. Go to the next slide. Let me just make sure. Okay, sorry.
Well, as BJ introduced, we're going to switch gears here a little bit and talk about some of the specific impacts. And as Doug mentioned at the outset, typically this is a little slower time of the year, but that has not been the case over the last month or so. And in terms of some of the larger impacts, I think we have to start with the Marshall Fire out in Colorado, which was just before New Year. A tragic event, but one which had very, very strong weather and climate connections. The event on that day, have to start off by saying that the preceding almost half year, even 7 months, was abnormally warm and dry. And drought, as BJ described in some of his graphics, has been a problem across much of the high plains up into the Front Range. And so at this point in time, at least it's late December, and after a very, very warm and mild December, the landscape was very, very dry, or abnormally dry, and that helps set the stage. On the left-hand side here, one graphic I think that's really says a great deal. This is from Russ Schumacher out at the Colorado Climate Center at Colorado State University. This is looking at 7-month periods between June and the end of December at Denver Central Park observation site. And what you're looking at here are anomalies for both mean temperatures and precipitation. And the temperature is on the vertical axis, the precipitation is on the horizontal axis. And basically what it says is that this 7-month period during 2021, again between June and the end of December, was the warmest and driest on record, at least at that site. And if it wasn't very far away from that at several other nearby sites as well. So again, this played a major role here. The second part of this, of course, and I'm sure most people have seen the footage from this, we had extremely high winds develop on that day as a result of a mountain wave, which developed in the Front Range and it was associated with a very, very strong westerly flow, strong jet above the Rocky Mountains. And on the lower left-hand side here in the schematic, we had downslope winds that accelerated down once they got onto the high plains, just along the Front Range, and even the formation of a rotor feature here. That's a rotary circulation pattern you can see here that's basically parallel to the spine of the Front Range. And all of those combined to create winds, sustained winds in the 50 to 60 mile per hour range, and some gusts of 80 to 100 miles per hour. So hurricane force, very, very strong winds in a large area there right along the Front Range. Of course, the result was catastrophic for several communities. The fire began near the town of Marshall in the morning and rapidly spread given the environmental conditions, very, very strong winds, low humidities, and grew in strength and intensity and severely damaged, especially the communities of Superior and Louisville were in the way. And as you can see here, some of the numbers, they're just terrible. Over 1,000 homes were destroyed. A total 6,200 acres were burned, but there was a fatality, and there's still one person missing from this. And it's when one looks at what happened, you can see some of the footage. On the left-hand side here is a picture of the fire in the early evening, looking down at the community. You can, again, just a horrible sight. And then on the right-hand side here, there's a pyrocumulus photo here taken by Becky Bollinger, also at the Colorado Climate Center, with the strong heating of the fire causing actually its own convection above. And then looking down from space down to the bottom, you can see how large this particular event was. But again, just a horrible setup meteorologically for intense fire conditions, and that's what we had. Shifting gears a little bit, but not too far away geographically, there's been increasing concern about winter wheat, which again was planted last fall and tried to establish. The problem, of course, given some of what we've just mentioned here, is that it's been very dry in portions of, especially of western production areas. On the left-hand side here on the map, this is outlining primary winter wheat production areas in green, and then superimposed on that, thanks to the ERS and USDA, are areas that are currently designated in drought, or recently were. This is back to December a little bit, and you can see that many western portions of some of the primary production areas here are in that drought area. You add on top of that the fact that it's been relatively dry since then. There aren't any crop condition updates since, but also we had a high wind event that caused soil erosion, dust storms, and all of these things have combined, likely to reduce or decrease the condition of the crop. And as of December, or as of the end of November, check that, the condition of the crop was the lowest since 2012, which was a big drought year for the Midwest, remember, and it certainly ranks among the lowest in terms of condition of the past 20 years of observations. And it really, again, weather hasn't gotten much better. One other thing here to note, and that is that in some portions of the Ohio Valley on the other side of the major production area, we've actually had excess precipitation that has also caused problems. So we've got some issues in different parts of the region for different reasons. So something to keep an eye on here as time goes along. We've also, as BJ showed and illustrated, had a very strong cold outbreak, a big change in jet stream flow across North America around New Year. And as a result of that, we've had a series of Arctic origin air masses move southward out of Canada and the Arctic into the upper Midwest. And especially, you can see on the left-hand side here, especially the northern part of the region, from the Dakotas eastward over into Wisconsin, Michigan, and even then down into Illinois and Iowa. And that has caused a number of problems with frozen water in pipes and infrastructure, things like fighting fires with frozen hydrants. It's also on an agricultural level, especially given the lack of snow in some portions of the region, it's caused soils to cool off much more rapidly than would be the case if they were insulated. And so we've got some very cold soil temperatures. And remember, too, that we've seen a rapid change because December was abnormally mild, and we went from much warmer than normal now to much colder than normal. So big changes are sometimes a problem for some crops. And finally, one that's now playing a role is with all of the colder weather here, certainly an increased demand for gas for heating needs and some concerns about that. One last thing to note, and you might put this in the favorable or beneficial category, is that with the cold soil temperatures and frozen soils and low, in some cases very, very low frost depths now, that should help increase the mortality of some of our agricultural pests. So we'd be talking about insects, diseases, and weeds as well. And with mild winters, there have been a few of those in the past. That has been an increasing issue in our part of the world. But with this type of condition, we would expect to see less of that. Last weekend, many of you personally experienced a major winter storm that moved across the area. And I'll show you the path here in just a moment here. But that occurred basically in the Midwest, in the south, and off to the east, the 14th through the 17th. It brought widespread high winds and then heavy snowfall to many areas, along with some mixed precipitation and just plain old rain, even some severe weather in the southern part of the U.S. But it impacted a large portion of the U.S., over 80 million people involved, and there were many, many disruptions in travel, flight cancellations, and power outages as well. Here's a graphic of that illustrating snow cover. Well, this is the snow depth actually on the 18th, but I think it illustrates the snow, much of that fell. Over a foot fell in portions of southern Minnesota into central Iowa. It was one of the largest events in central Iowa for some time. There was also heavy snow. You could see a very, very unusual storm track here, starting in the prairie provinces of Canada and Saskatchewan on the 13th, and then moving southwestward into the central Great Plains, down into the south, and then back up again, up the eastern seaboard along I-95, and ultimately into Quebec and the Canadian Maritimes. A very, very unusual pattern. And note, I know some of you follow these things, this type of a storm track, extremely unusual, primarily in terms of how much moisture was associated with this system, because initially, the first couple of days, this was virtually all Pacific moisture, and it's very unusual to see that much precip. It did, though, when it got down to the south, it picked up moisture from the Gulf of Mexico and ultimately from the Atlantic, and then that you can see there was a widespread heavy snow across the east. The red marker there, want a shout out to Ashtabula, Ohio. That was the largest event, or largest total that at least observed in storm, 27.2 inches, which combines both the synoptic snowfall from the system itself plus some enhanced lake effect off of Lake Erie. So very, very large event. And one final note here, note that, and BJ showed this as one of his graphics, there are areas of the Corn Belt here, especially the eastern Corn Belt, that have had very, very little snow. And this storm just illustrates that pattern with almost no snow over portions of the eastern Corn Belt, is that it made that unusual U-shaped pattern. So that has contributed to the lack of frozen precip in that part of the region. Finally, and if you're wondering, no, we're not expanding our geographic coverage here outside of the north central region, but there was a violent super volcanic eruption on the 15th last weekend out in the South Pacific on the island archipelago of Tonga. And you can see the official name of this volcano, but it erupted here over the weekend. There's an image of it taken from satellite, and you can see literally the shock wave and the blast wave. This was a violent eruption. It was the strongest eruption at that particular volcano in more than 1,000 years, and the strongest volcanic eruption globally since Mount Pinatubo in June of 1991. And that's why I'm bringing it up here, because many of you may remember, if you're old enough like me, in the year following 1991, because of the amount of ash and sulfur dioxide from Pinatubo, we had a decrease in temperatures globally of about 1 degree Fahrenheit. It lasted almost a couple years. It was certainly 1 year and into the second year. So these events, even though they're a long, long way away, can sometimes have impacts on global climate. And I think the bottom line here is, and even though this was a very, very violent eruption, and it had an ash and gas plume, it reached 24 miles in height. That's one of the big constraints here. And it got into the second layer of the atmosphere, the stratosphere. And that's very, very important, because most of this material, when it's ejected into the troposphere, the lowest layer, its residence time is relatively short. It's only a few days, and gravity takes most of that material out. But if it makes it into the second layer, the stratosphere, which is about 9 or 10 miles above the surface or greater, then it can stay there for extended long periods of time. And for this particular eruption, you can see 24 miles. That is, by the way, probably the largest recorded height of a volcanic eruption observed, and then there's been several decades of that taking place. So again, it was very violent. But the last point here is the most important one, and that is, yes, it had a very, very high plume height, but the sulfur dioxide emissions from this volcano and what it ejected were relatively low. Mount Pinatubo ejected 20 to 24 million tons of sulfur dioxide when it erupted again back in the early 90s. The Tonga volcano, right now, the estimate is only about 400,000. So a tiny fraction, 1 or 2% of what we saw from Pinatubo. And as a result of that, most of the experts here that study this believe that even though it's a violent eruption, there's not enough to cause a significant change in temperature globally. So we'll have to stay tuned, though. There could be more eruptions, but as of now, the thought is that this will not have any impact on global climate. So looking at that and shifting gears a little bit to where we're headed in terms of our outlooks, some of it's more the same, but some of the new long lead outlooks, you will, if you've been following those, some of this is going to look very, very familiar to you. I'm going to start by looking at the equatorial Pacific here and the El Nino Southern Oscillation. Of course, most of you realize we are currently in a La Nina event. We've been there since last fall. It's the second one in 2 years. We had one previously last winter as well, and this is a second La Nina. On the left-hand side here, you see a time-lapse loop from the mid-fall up through recently. Sea surface temperatures here on the top depicted in color, and then on the bottom, these are anomalies with the sea surface temperatures relative to normal, and that's probably the one to look at. But what you can easily see here, for much of the eastern and central equatorial Pacific, the cooler than normal water, that's the landmark signature right along the equator of a cool event, a La Nina event, and what is now thought of primarily as a mature La Nina event. So we're getting towards maybe towards the latter stages of this particular event, and that's indeed what the guidance does suggest as we look ahead. On the top here, this is a graphic of sea surface temperatures, basically the ENSO index. When it's negative, more than 0.5 degrees Celsius negative, we have a La Nina event, which is where we are. Of course, on the opposite side, if it's a 0.5 degree Celsius warmer, then we have an El Nino, and then neutral is in between. But in general, the outlooks here, most of them, this is a cloud of different forecasts that we see. Most of them suggest a gradual increase in temperatures and then back to neutral conditions here in the equatorial Pacific by probably by this summer, and then maybe continuing into the fall. And the actual statistics and odds here from the forecasters, again, call for La Nina conditions to continue for a few more months, about 2/3 of a chance for that, and then neutral by the summer. And one thing, though, that you will see here in the following images is that La Nina definitely is having an impact on our outlooks and what we expect here for the next several months. The typical weather conditions associated with El Nino in the winter in the northern hemisphere here in North America include a relatively high amplitude jet stream flow across North America. We certainly have seen that so far this year, although it really hasn't been a classic La Nina pattern. But here in the Midwest, a couple things you can see because of this dip down of the jet stream into the middle of the country. We sometimes see colder than normal mean temperatures across portions of the high plains, and then a little bit further west than that. One of the key factors, though, key impacts or influences here is a stronger than normal storm or a storm track, an active storm track through the Ohio Valley, which leads to wetter than normal conditions. And this would be portions of the central and eastern Corn Belt. And so you're going to see that theme show up in our outlooks. So looking ahead here, the pattern that we've been in since the beginning of January essentially is forecast to continue for at least another 1 to 2 weeks. So right now, very, very good odds that the cold and mostly drier than normal scenario that we've seen with northwesterly upper airflow across the region will continue. We've got yet another Arctic origin air masses over us currently. There's another one that's going to be on the way here for the weekend. And as a result of this, probably also seeing drier than normal conditions, Gulf of Mexico moisture limited here. And you can see for most of the region, we're talking about certainly less than 1/2 inch, many places less than 1/4 inch. There will be one exception to that, and that would be near the lakes likely to pick up some significant lake effect snows in the lees of the lake. So at least for the next 1 to 2 weeks, probably through the end of January, colder and drier than normal. So we look into the medium range forecast guidance. That's sort of what you see here as a continuation. This is for the 27th through the 2nd of February now into the early part of February, and you can still see this colder than normal pattern favored over much of the eastern half of the country. Again, that's looking at that northwesterly flow. And then on the right-hand side here with precipitation probabilities, much of the region indicated or favoring the drier than normal scenario. So cooler and drier than normal. But there's a caveat here, and that is that the medium range forecast guidance now is also suggesting maybe a change in the jet stream in early February to something different and maybe a little bit more like what we saw in portions of December, and a shift of the colder air perhaps out into, at least out into the Rockies and into the western U.S. once again. So that should probably lead to a moderation in temperatures sometime in early February. At least that's what the guidance is suggesting now, and maybe also a little bit of a pickup in terms of precipitation as well. Looking at the brand new long lead outlooks from CPC that were issued this morning, and again, if you saw previous issuances of, and this goes actually all the way back to last fall, but very, very similar pattern here. Most of these are based on, of course, on the La Niña conditions in the Pacific, but also, especially the earlier periods here, also are reliant on the numerical forecast guidance. But in general, they call for increased odds of warmer than normal temperatures across southern and eastern portions of the region here, with equal chances as you go north and west up into the high plains. At the same time, and this is that La Niña signature I talked about for central and eastern portions of our region, enhanced probability of above normal precipitation, decreasing back to equal chances. One thing I would also note here too, we mentioned winter wheat and the fact that there have been problems and lack of moisture and stress. Note here for at least portions of the southern Great Plains and into some of the high plains in areas that were designated here as at least in some distress, that not much help, at least here for the next couple months. Here's the outlook for February through April, again, just issued this morning. And if it looks like deja vu and just like what we just saw, well, you're right on. And you're going to see this maybe even one more time, but very, very similar pattern here to what we just saw for the month of February. So no, again, major changes. I think the big issue here, though, again, is wetter than normal conditions are expected to return across the eastern portion of the region. One thing also to mention, and BJ showed the drought conditions and where they've been, but a couple things we can take home given that outlook. One is that the drought conditions are likely to continue across the far western portion of the north central region, especially in the high plains, with maybe even some increase in some portions. You can see here in central Nebraska and Kansas. In contrast, drought areas that are currently designated in drought condition here across the upper Midwest, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, those are projected to improve over the next couple of months. So that's a little bit of a change in it, but again, a fairly strong east to west type of gradient with the pattern is expected. Finally, looking beyond this for the May through July period, so into the early half of the summer, also very similar to what we've just seen. Much of the Midwest is in an area of increased odds of warmer than normal conditions, and then also for the central eastern Corn Belt, increased odds of above normal precipitation. So and beyond this, most of the region, we move into late summer, just for what it's worth, most of the region is more in the equal chances. So not much of a signal forecast direction one way or the other, but certainly for the early part of the summer, tilted much of the region towards milder and a little bit wetter than normal. So wrapping up here, again, for the outlook, colder and drier than normal, very, very strong bet and likelihood for the next couple of weeks with the same upper air pattern suggested, but then the guidance is also suggesting maybe a change in early February to something at least a little bit more or a little bit warmer than what January will end up to be, and possibly with a little bit of an increase in precipitation as well. Our long lead outlooks all very, very similar. They're based on ENSO, the La Niña, and as well as the numerical forecast guidance, but for most of the region, especially the central and east, a little bit milder than normal is the favored scenario, plus a normal to above normal precipitation. And with that, I'll wrap up here by a mention, a shout out to our partners. And again, a reminder, there are recorded presentations here of all of these presentations. You can see the URL there. And welcome, that's hosted by the Midwest Regional Climate Center. And then again, some of our partners that BJ has already introduced. And with that, I'll say thank you and note our panelists and those who have contributed and can help answer questions here for both our climate and weather needs. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Doug.
All right, thanks, Jeff. We have a number of questions. I will try to get to all of this, or as many as I can, I'll say, before the top of the hour. One thing I'll say to both Jeff, BJ, and Brad, who are part of our panel, is that there are some questions I've assigned to you. I don't know if you know that or not, but I can do that during the during the thing. And obviously, if you're talking, you can't answer them. Anyway, there's a heads up to those of you. So I'm gonna start this. This is one I'm gonna send to Jeff, or I sent to Jeff. Are there any concerns about the lack of snowfall in Illinois, specifically Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio for the growing season?
I would say there certainly are concerns, but we also have to remember, and the concerns would be primarily about moisture, and we have to remember snow is a pain to clean up and move around, of course, but in an agricultural sense, has many positive attributes and benefits. The insulation of the soil surface is one, of course, but more importantly, it's a source of water, and it's a controlled source of water. When it does melt, it's a perfect way to get water typically into the soil profile, and that's of course agriculturally what we need now with our seasonal recharge. And because we've had so little snow there, that portion is missing. But on the other hand, here this is the driest time of the year climatologically for that part of the region. We don't see that much in the way of precipitation anyway. And if things changed here later on, here late February, March, April, we could easily make up. Of course, you can always have too much of a good thing. Too much water is not a good thing in the spring either. But I think right now, yes, it's a concern, but it isn't. I don't think it's way up there. Not as much as what we see, for example, for some of the winter wheat crop out west. So it's something very, very unusual. And I think actually from what I've seen and what I've heard from my colleagues, some of the lack of snow is actually approaching record-breaking levels in some. So it's very, very unusual to go this long and to have this little snowfall. So it isn't something that's been seen very often.
Okay. Hey, thanks, Jeff. And there was a question about, can we get a hold of this presentation? And yes, you always can. It takes time to get it uploaded on the web and everything. So I usually tell people about 24 hours afterwards. I did put a link in the question. You'll see an answer to that question in your question panel, whatever you want to call it. And so you can find those links. There's a couple different places to get those when it's updated. Again, it'll probably be sometime tomorrow. Yeah, the next question is about North Dakota, and really we could say North Dakota, and to some degree Montana and South Dakota, but really focused on North Dakota at the moment. I'm going to bring in Adnan, who happens to be on the line. And the question, Adnan is, by the way, Adnan Akius is the state climatologist for North Dakota, and he had a couple comments about about recovery. I'll just put it that way, and the good comments. So go ahead, Adnan. I got you live.
Thanks for the opportunity, Doug. Yes, North Dakota is in the trend of improving the drought conditions, especially leaving the exceptional drought behind, especially in the central North Dakota. However, we still have to keep in mind that the 2020-2021 drought was very intense, and in fact, it was the highest intensity since 2000 and comparable to 1936 and 1988 drought. And we are going to feel the hangover, and the impacts are gonna leak into the next growing season. We have to keep in mind that the Western North Dakota is still feeling the impact of the drought. Some of them are overgrazed pastures. They haven't recovered yet, low on hay, low in water levels, and high on the total dissolved solids. It is still a concern. When you look at the snow pattern, northeastern portion of the state were very lucky to receive very helpful snowfall, and therefore, and those regions are on the way to recover. However, western half of the state is still snow-free. And winter time in North Dakota is usually a recovery time. And I am concerned, along with the many ranchers in the southwestern, especially southwestern portions of the state, where D2 conditions were expanded this week. If the snow doesn't, the fall, those regions, I'm afraid, is going to come into the spring as D2 severe drought and even exceptional drought will continue into the next growing season.
Thank you, Adnan. And that kind of goes on to, it kind of leads into a part of the other discussion, some of the other questions about is the drought over or recovering or getting better? And what does La Nina mean for all of that? And I wish we had all the answers, but we don't. You saw Jeff's presentation about sort of the northwest portion, Montana-ish area, maybe Wyoming, leaning towards better chances for above normal precipitation and cooler than normal temperatures. By no means is that that may be a leaning, but it's not a hard and strong forecast. That's a La Nina forecast, by the way. What Adnan is mentioning, and all of us are, I'll say, concerned about is, yeah, we may get average precipitation. Hopefully we get above, but if we just get average or below, the ease it will be to flip into really bad drought is higher than normal. That's what I'll say. So I'd say our risk level still, because we're coming out of such a bad drought, is the risk level is still high. Okay. Okay, moving on. What are the dangers of snow drought in the north central region prior to the growing season? Would lower corn and soybean yields be expected? I think Jeff sort of got into that a little bit. Yeah, I think where there's very severe drought last year, perhaps we do need some snow in winter and fall and spring precipitation to relieve that. So I would say, like I just said, the risk is higher in those places that have experienced what we call D2 or worse drought or pretty severe drought. Okay, I did put a link in here to the soil moisture models I think that you used from CPC. I did put a link in here to the accumulated winter severity index. That is in there if you want to look at that. Jeff, you're one of the best speakers we've ever had on here, quote unquote. Okay, golly gee, yeah, we forgot about this, and I apologize because it was on my radar and then it was off. So we had this huge fire in Kansas, 365, I think it's not acres, square kilometers, I think. Yeah. So Kim, I'm sorry, we didn't cover that. Anybody want to mention anything about that fire? I know it had a major impact on the on farmland out there and some particular homesteads and things like that.
I think Justin may have covered that a little bit last month. I may be mistaken, but I think he may have covered that in the briefing last month.
Okay. Well, I do want to recognize that as a major issue. It was. I don't believe it was the same time as the. Don't believe it was within a day or two of the Boulder Fire or Louisville Fire in Colorado. I don't think so.
And it was related to a passing low pressure system.
Yeah,
usually strong low pressure system. So quite different from what we saw in the Front Range, but also at the same time it was over a much larger area and but similar circumstances because of the extended dryness and drought conditions and dry landscape, high winds, low humidity, all combined. And I think the other, I guess it's not good visibility, but the fire risk, danger risk index that's used operationally by NWS, I believe it was the highest value that they had recorded for that particular event. It was, again, the conditions that were forecast were thought to be, so, and of course it did unfortunately turn out to be a large event. And I think all of that is really, there may be some material on that in the last briefing.
Jeff, do you want to touch, or anybody want to touch on the potential for La Nina drought in the central southern plains for sure, but up into the central plains, up into Kansas, Nebraska, Colorado, maybe even Wyoming, because that is again, a rule of thumb is that area dries out, especially in the spring with La Ninas. And then, if anybody wants to really broach an odd subject, the potential for, and this is really a separate subject, but potential for a third La Nina year in a row, which can happen, but it's relatively rare.
Yeah. I just, and I'll throw it back to Brad or BJ, but for the southern plains, I think that's an area that has to be watched very closely. But for the same caveat I mentioned before, remember, it isn't, the outlook certainly is not favorable. It actually suggests that the conditions may even deteriorate a little bit here at least over the next couple of months. But also remember, that's, again, climatologically, this is the driest time of the year, and that a lot can change. And we saw that with annual crops in the upper Midwest this year. We started with a drought and ended up with a deluge of too much precipitation, but incredibly, our yield and our productivity was well above average. So things can change. It's just for that winter crop, of course, it has to happen earlier in the spring when the water is really needed. And so the key months, I think, are really going to be, we get into March and into early April. That's when it's going to get critical. And if we miss then, and if that outlook is correct, there likely will be problems, unfortunately.
Yep, and this leads into another question we have about wildfires in 2022. The dry air is getting drier, or even not so dry air is getting drier, and I'll just say late winter, spring, before green up fires. And I think we're talking about, golly, I'm not sure if we're talking about forest fires or prairie fires, but I'm gonna say prairie fires for discussion today. It looks like dry air is getting drier, chances are higher than average temperatures and all that stuff. So I don't think we have anything official right now that we looked up, but it certainly goes to follow with what you're posing, Doug, in terms of a busy fire season. And if there is a person who wants to comment, feel free.
Jeff, do you want to take this, or?
But go ahead, please.
Yeah, I guess I would just comment. I think it'd be something like Jeff said in his previous comment. Things can change rapidly going into spring. However, with things being dry on the landscape and not much improvement forecast for the central plains in terms of drought status, that is something to monitor quite a bit going into the spring. Fire conditions, it could be an active fire season given what's out there. And then I'll also just add in, there was one more question. I'm not sure if it got answered before on La Nina, if we'd have a third La Nina in a row. I think Jeff touched on that in his outlooks. The forecast plumes right now indicate we likely will not. It's a return to more neutral conditions. However, La Ninas can be longer lived than El Ninos generally, and it's still a possibility, but the forecasts where they're at are indicating more towards neutral conditions.
Yeah, the only reason I bring up the third possibility is because there were a number of models, and somebody brought it up on an internal call that, gosh, is this going to mean we're going to have a third one? Has that ever happened? And so that's why I bring it up at all. All right, on we go.
It can. So. Yeah.
And winds coming off the Rockies and near Boulder reminded someone of a hydrologic jump with water, and I think it's a fluid. So yes, it's very similar. And there's a lot of downslope heat generated in terms of warming the air column. And I know that gets a little technical, but really when you compress air, you're heating it up, and you're shoving it down a mountain, which also leads to that. I don't know, Jeff, you can comment more on this. You had more slides and stuff focused on this. I don't know what constricted it to that particular area, but it was a fairly constricted area north to south where that happened. We heard from one person in Fort Collins, which is hardly, it is more than a stone's throw, but not that much, that really the winds were not exceptional at all up there.
And one incredible observation, if you remember the figure I showed, the little schematic that did show the downslope, and then the formation of that rotor feature, that sort of circular spinning tube there actually were easterly. So all of these winds crashing, screaming down the mountains, down onto the high plains, were out of the west. And then on the other side of the rotor, there actually were some weak easterly winds reported and actually observed. Again, it's a rare combination of the synoptic wind flow across the region, the atmospheric stability that was there, and it was a very unusual mix of circumstances all at the same time. But again, when you look at what happened and the conditions there, I think one would almost have to conclude too, it's a miracle that there weren't more problems, and you have to hats off to the emergency people who warned people to get out of the way. They had to evacuate over 35,000 people in very, very, very little time because it was moving so fast. So it could have probably, unfortunately, been a lot worse.
Okay, very quickly, and I'm going to throw this to Brad because we're talking about the growing season, and but feel free, Jeff or BJ, to come in. Any concerns about the solar cycle? Will the intense solar radiation be a concern this growing season? And my 2 cents is no, but go ahead, Brad, if you have anything you want to say about that. Maybe I'm off base.
I'd agree with you on that, and I think we're just more focused on the current state of drought and really watching that high plains region. We'll get a new set of numbers from USDA NASS next Tuesday in their state stories that'll give an update on winter wheat conditions and soil moisture ratings. So those who are keeping an eye on crop conditions, look ahead to that noon next Tuesday, and that'll give us, again, that update. Just looking at the very latest ag and drought stats that we posted this morning on the chief economist of USDA website, we've got more than 2/3 of the winter wheat crop, 68%, located within a drought area at this time. But if you switch to corn and soybeans, those numbers are a lot lower, 19% and 14% respectively. So as we head through the rest of the winter into the spring, a lot of that focus is going to be on that high plains region, where the La Niña composites continue to indicate that we'll see drier than normal conditions.
All right, and just a couple more comments about the Kansas fire. 100-mile-an-hour winds, a couple people did perish. Lots and lots of cattle, thousands of cattle died as well. And of course, I think some structures as well. And I guess the final question is, what city or what area is the red barn picture from, Jeff?
That's from northern lower Michigan, up in near the Gaylord area. So if anybody's familiar with northern Michigan, that's where that's from. And a fairly typical scene this time of the year, except it's blue skies. That's not typical for this time of the year. Had to wait to get to that a few days.
Yep. Every once in a while it clears out, right?
Yeah.
Okay, I think that wraps it up. I don't know if there's any other comments anybody wants to make in terms of moving into the I'll just say late winter season. We're sure hoping. I know snow is a pain, but for a lot of us, snow is important. And we talk about snow drought for a reason, right? Not only recreation, but for lots of other ecosystem issues as well. Same with cold. We need cold. I know it's a pain and it causes lots of issues, but we do need cold for a lot of reasons. So I don't want to say pray for cold, but let's hope we get a reasonable amount of seasonal cold for the rest of the year, and snowfall and precipitation generally. So anything else? Other than Peter Goebel from the Colorado Climate Center will be here next month. He's a great speaker as well. You'll have a Western perspective on things, which will be slightly different than Jeff and BJ, but that's okay. I think that's it. Thanks for everybody for hanging in there till the bitter end. Really thanks, Jeff and BJ, for your hard work. I know this is not easy. And thanks, Brad, for joining at the last minute. Appreciate that very much as well. I'm going to conclude it and stop the recording. So thanks all. See you next month.